Good morning, my angels. Today in social studies, you are going to be learning about dun, 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 Roman architecture, specifically ancient Roman architecture. You should, before we start, have a note, like a piece of paper that has notes to take, right? So you're just going to fill them in. I think you've already done this before once, so you should. This isn't you writing every sentence that's on the board or on the slideshow you're about to see. It's just you hitting the highlights and answering those questions. Don't worry, you can always watch the video twice. I'm going to put the link on Classera. Classera? Yeah, on Classera, if I can figure out how. It'll be there, it'll be fine. And when I come back, we'll walk through it and make sure everybody has the right information, okay? But it's going to be laid out for you. So let's get started. Ancient Roman architecture. There are three main characteristics of the architecture. Number one is the arches. Arches use less material. Excuse me. They're beautiful and they're structurally sound. Now, what I mean by structurally sound is that they are easy to use. Not easy to use. Structurally sound means that it's secure. Like the building isn't going to fall over. Think about a building made of concrete versus a building made of like a bunch of rocks, not concrete but rocks. One is more structurally sound. One is going to stay standing longer because if an earthquake comes, the concrete might wiggle, but the rocks are going to tumble down. That building is not structurally sound. But arches, they are structurally sound and they're beautiful. Like, duh, have you ever seen an arch before? So if you haven't, please look at this picture. Arches are like the curved top. It's like if you took a door frame and made it a circle on the top instead of a square. Quite lovely. There is something called a vault, which is a long arched ceiling, which they can also be called a barrel vault. It's like if you took a barrel, right, or like a bucket, and cut it in half long ways so that the ceiling is like a long half bucket. They're very beautiful. I've seen several. Here are some images for you to look at. Quite beautiful, right? They're stunning and spectacular in every possible way. And they're also, like, they use arches all the time. They use them, like, on the outsides of buildings. Like, you'll see on the Coliseum, there are arches on the outside of buildings. They use them as, obviously, entranceways or windows. And a lot of monuments are made, like, with arches around them and on them. So there's a famous arch called the Arc de Triomphe. It's in France. It is, I probably just butchered how to pronounce it. It is like, it's the Arc of Triumph, right? And so you're supposed to walk through it once you triumph. And there's a whole history about it, but we don't need to know that history. What you need to know is that even now, arches are a way to make something more fancy looking without like damaging the integrity of the building, right? So it's still going to be a safe building to be in, and it'll look pretty. Think of like windows, arched windows, right? Curved windows at the top. A lot of churches have arched windows. A lot of the mosques you see driving down the road here in Riyadh even have beautiful intricate arches, so they're not just circular. They've got like little squiggly lines and stuff. I think I put a picture in this video so you can see what I mean by squiggly lines. I don't know the shape, like a diamond almost. So that's arches, right? That's the number one, the first characteristic. Again, vaults are long arch ceilings, and they can be called barrel vaults, and arches are used all over the place in ancient Rome. We even saw them on those aqueducts. Okay, the second one are domes, right? Domes are like, it's like you took a semicircle and you put it on top of a building. That is a dome. You see it in modern times in my state house, right? Like where our government sits. You see it in our capital. You see it on the building over here by school. Robert and I call it the Knot California, but it's got like a green dome on it. You'll see that. Like the dome's made of lights. I don't know if you guys drive around here at night with your family, but there's a dome made out of lights. So domes are impressive because a triangle roof is easy because you lean, right? It leans on each other, so it puts the pressure on each other right here in the middle. And then a flat roof is easy because you just lay the flat things. But a dome, since it's curved, like a head, since it's curved, right, it's harder, I don't know how to show you best, it's harder to maintain all the weight and pressure. So they have to build it a perfect way so that it doesn't collapse inside. If you've ever been at the beach and dug a hole in the sand, or in the desert and dug like a hole in the sand and dug it out and then it collapses in, it doesn't have enough support to not collapse in. So a dome is really very it shows mechanical skill to be able to build it, right? It's not just like a flat roofed home. This takes a lot of pre-thought and engineering and architectural flair. And a lot of things have domes. Not to mention like baths, like literal baths, right? Remember we talked about how they were community? Lots of people came together. Sorry if it's loud. Would come together to the baths. It was like a social spot, like a spa almost. Men and women are separate. They're doing their own thing, mud baths, whatever. But baths have the domes because you can put a hole in the middle, right? So there's a place that still has a hole in the middle, and since all the air funnels out of the hole, no rain comes in, which is super cool, right? So the weather doesn't get in through the hole because all the air is getting pushed out through the hole. So baths look beautiful, and they're a nice architectural piece that you see dotted all through Rome and ancient Roman sub-city states. You can also see like the Parthenon has a perfect dome. It has that hole in the middle, right? So it's completely structurally sound. No rain gets in, and it was built a bajillion years ago, and it's still like in use. I went in it with my cousins. Here's a picture of us smiling outside the front of it, and it's stunning. But domes are, a spot to look, to make the building look fancier, kind of like the arch, right? The Romans, they figured out how to build things, and then they're like, let's figure out how to make them fancier. So those are domes. So the first is arches, second is domes. Third is columns, right? We know what we mean by columns. They're the individual, basically, poles that holds things up, right? So there are 3 types of columns ranging throughout the Roman Empire, and they get fancier as you go on. There is the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Those are the 3 types of columns, and so they get fancier as they go on. Corinthian is like the real fancy ones. And you'll see, columns are everywhere. My parents have columns on their house. I'm pretty sure MGIS has columns at the front of the school. They're everywhere. You can have, obviously, square columns, but the Romans really loved a good circular column. And we saw this in Greece, too. So they took the ancient Greek columns, and they said, we're going to make those prettier. And so they decorated the tops and the bottoms, and they made them, really smooth or out of one piece of marble instead of stacking them. And so you'll see here some pictures of columns, and you should see the 3 types. And you should be able to identify the 3 types of columns, right? Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Okay, major buildings. I'm going to list like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. You follow through with your notes, okay? So the first is the Coliseum. The Coliseum was built in between 72 and 80 AD or BCE. CE. 72 to 80 CE. And it is spherical in shape with a raised section to see a flat middle. So the Coliseum is super cool in that they had a whole, basically city underneath it. They dug out the ground, built a city, covered it over, and then built the Coliseum on top. So when you go to this Coliseum, and in this picture that I'm about to show you, you can see the city underneath, right? Like when they uncovered it, they were like, what, a whole city? And it's like 2 levels, and they had spaces for people to sleep, and there were markets, and there were all the stuff under, because the Coliseum was an amphitheater, which is a type of theater, an amphitheater, used for a variety of things, mostly entertainment, right? So it wouldn't be for meetings per se, but it would be for entertainment. They would have gladiator matches, and we'll talk about gladiators later. They'd have gladiator matches, and at one point, they could fill it with water, the whole, middle flat part, they could fill with water, and have, miniature naval battles, there, so that, if you're a farmer, you can come and see this naval battle that happened a million miles away. It's very, very, very high tech for, 72/80 CE. That's the first 70 years in the Common Era, and they have a space that can be flooded and released with water, and they had makeshift elevators. Obviously, it wasn't electrical elevators, but it was with weights, and they had a way to cover it if it rained. They could roll out this canvas that would cover the whole thing. And what's cool is that everybody could come. So everyone could come to the gatherings, everyone could come to the executions. If you were on the the poor side of the society, you would sit at the top, but everybody was allowed to come in for free. And it's absolutely incredible. So It's colossal too. It's massive, and it has 2 rings on the outside. So you'll see a picture of that. Now, theaters and amphitheaters, right? We just said the Coliseum is an amphitheater, meaning that it's raised seating around the middle section. A theater, we all know what a theater looks like. Movie theaters are very similar, right? They have an amphitheater style where it's raised to see the flat bottom. Normal theaters could be there's just seating looking at a stage, or there's a big wall with a stage. I've included some images of theaters here. They're used for meetings and plays and political gatherings and executions. And they have like a semicircle shape with that flat back, if you see it. And like I said, it can be used for meetings or even plays. Some people say that Julius Caesar, someone we'll talk about later, that he was stabbed to death in a theater. That's pretty cool. But, we have, in the U.S., we go to Washington, D.C. to have, that's like where our seat of government is, and that's where they have their debates and everything, but on like the national level. But in Rome, they would go to these theaters and have these strong debates with philosophers and other politicians and that kind of thing. So theaters play a huge role. Remember, Greek theater was big. The Romans took it and, like pretty much everything else, tried to make it better. Now let's look at baths, so literal baths. So there's a place in the UK called Bath because the Romans went all the way up there from Italy to the UK and built a bath over a hot spring. So somehow they figured out where these hot springs were. And they would sit there and they would build a whole intricate, beautiful bath around hot spring. And the hot spring, if you don't know, is a natural warm pool. So like where water is naturally warm from being heated from the earth. And so what the Romans would do is they would find these spaces, or they would make their own heated water by stacking like like tiles with fire around it, so it would heat the floor and heat the water. And they would build these several rooms. There'd be like a cold pool, there'd be a really hot pool, there'd be a medium pool. There would be space to like do like what we would be like a sea salt scrub. They'd scrub themselves down with oils and sands, and there would be a spot like a steam room and a sauna, obviously all without electricity. And there would be places where they could just swim for leisure, or they could exercise. And bathing and cleanliness was something that was very important to the Romans, right? You had to clean before you go into temple. Everybody had access to clean water, like we learned from the aqueduct section of our last unit. And so these baths were a way for everybody in the community, from plebeian to like the other, what are they called? Proletariats, whatever they were. From the top to the bottom, everybody could go into these baths and use them and get clean and have a relaxing moment. Not saying everybody had time for it, but it was a unique space where class wasn't really recognized. They had private baths. Some people in the town of Pompeii, which we'll learn more about. In the town of Pompeii, they had a public bath, but they also had private baths for the people who were like extra wealthy. They would have a bath in their home that was like fancy and warm and expensive, and they would have mosaics on the floor. We'll get back to Pompeii in a second. I know that's on your notes. Don't freak out. But right now, the last spot is our temples. So temples were obviously a place of worship. So Jewish people still call their place of worship a temple, which I think is really cool. Temples, as you can see, if you're looking at them, temples are these like incredible monuments. So some temples would have like like a statue of the god or goddess inside it. Remember, we learned that the gods and goddesses are very similar to one another, and in that they're the same but different names. And so the temple might have a statue of the god or goddess, might have an altar, might have an antechamber. So some places had, a whole city designed just for this temple, right? It would be around the temple, and the temple would be the focal point. And some temples are on the road. So there's a temple of Poseidon in Greece. Obviously, I know we're talking about Rome, but just to get a reference. In Greece, there's a temple of Poseidon that's just like randomly on a rock. Given it's on the rock on the water, so that makes sense, god of water, of the ocean, of the sea. But it's far away from like any cities, and that's because if people were traveling between two cities, they would still need to stop and make, a sacrifice or pray or whatever. So they would build a temple in the middle and have one or two people keeping it up, living in a house right nearby, so that travelers would have somewhere to go if they were in between cities. Think of it like if you drive to Jeddah or to Bahrain or whatever. There's just mosques in the middle of the desert because if people are driving and want to stop to pray, you want a space to do that. And so that's why there's temples in like random locations. So here are some temples. When thinking about temples and cities in Rome, you also have to think about, where they got their goods. We can go to the grocery store, but for them, they didn't have like a mass supermarket. What they had was a forum, and a forum was a place of commerce, basically of shopping and hanging out, right? So you could get what you needed to get, and that's also where the items would be produced. So if you were a potter, right, you're making pottery, you would make your pottery in the back, and then you come and sell it at the front. So forums were a place of production and purchase. So you would go and you would make your thing there. That's where you work. That's also where people would come and get the stuff that you made. Forums in Pompeii, what we're going to talk about in a second, was incredible. So they could excavate and they found exactly where it was. And since Pompeii was the way Pompeii was, which we'll get to, actually we'll just explain Pompeii now. Pompeii is a city in Rome, or in Italy, I mean, from the ancient Roman times. And on the 24th of August, 79 CE, right, 79 AD, like this section of time, Mount Vesuvius, a mountain/volcano above it, like it was on the base of it, erupted very badly. Like it was a big, big eruption. I think I've talked about this with you guys before. And it covered the entire city in ash and then lava, and few people survived. Unfortunately. The people that could get to the water and into boats survived, but everybody else died in the city. And so there was no time to pack your belongings and evacuate. They just got stuck where they were. So when they finally found Pompeii, however long ago, they uncovered the whole city. And so everything was left exactly where it belonged. So when they dug out the forum, right, they knew it was the forum because it was this long rectangle of land that was, paved. They had obviously some columns in there. They had a temple and an altar at one end. They had a theater on the other. And they had all these stalls, right, like all these shop entrances. And in the back half, there would be pottery. And in the front half, it would look like a store. And in the back half, there would be, remnants of foods, as if it was a granary or a bakery. And in the front half, there'd be a store, or there would be remnants of clothing or paint or tiles or tools. And so they could determine, obviously the potter worked here and the baker was here and the, electrician was here. Not really an electrician. And so Pompeii gives us this incredible insight into everyday life in a Roman city-state because everything was intact. Everything's still there. And of course the people are still there. And I know I've showed you guys the Pompeii bodies before. Here's another picture of it. And Pompeii, the reason that they have these casts of people is because when they died, they were packed under so much ash that their body decomposed, but then it left a hole, it left a pocket. Like when you do your hands into resin or whatever it's called, and you make that weird silicone hand mold. So they could fill it then with concrete, and we have these casts of how people died. Absolutely fascinating. And they're still excavating parts of Pompeii even today to try to find out more about the disaster and how people lived and the people who lived there. Because again, it's all just there. And here's a picture of me in Pompeii with my cousins. Yay, go Italy. So it's really cool. We'll look a little bit more at Pompeii in the coming weeks just because it's a really, really fascinating find. It's super cool, and it tells us a lot about Roman society, which is kind of the whole point of the unit. Lastly, your homework for social studies. I know, you usually don't have any, but you do now. I want you to Google Roman ruins, find one that you like, that you feel, connected to, whatever. It can be a temple, it can be, don't do the Coliseum, but it can be a Coliseum. There's one in Verona, if you wanted to look that one up. It's the first Coliseum, so it's kind of the test trial. Everyone has to do something different, so fight it out on what you do. It doesn't have to be different. If you end up doing the same one, that's fine. But you're going to pick a Roman ruin, and you're going to find out a lot about it. I want a paragraph, so 7 to 10 complete sentences, not lines, on that Roman ruin. And you're going to show a picture of it, right? It's going to be a slide. And you're going to have a picture of it and then some fast facts. And you're going to tell us about that ruin, where it is, when it was built, what it was used for, that kind of thing. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And of course, as always, be good and make good choices, and I will see you guys so soon.